drawing students, this is a demo on citing multiple objects. And this demo will build off of the previous demo on citing one object, and now citing multiple objects, you're able to understand more fully the process of citing as it relates to several objects in a composition. So what you're going to need for this is 18 by 24 paper, again, a citing stick, and pencils. What you're going to need are 2H, HB, B, and 2B pencils. In these first couple of steps, you're only going to be using that 2H pencil, and I'll talk about that in a second. The next thing that you need are 3 to 4 objects, and I want you to start being intentional about the objects that you're choosing for these still lives. One, we want them to range in complexity. We want simple objects and slightly more complex objects, but nothing that has a lot of parts and pieces to it just yet. Two, I want you to think about things that you might like to draw, things that might mean something to you, rather than just kind of like any old objects around the house. The reason for that is because you'll be more interested in drawing it and drawing it for a longer period of time. And then what we want to think about too in making a still life is ranging in heights between things. We don't want all the same heights of objects, we want to range in heights between them, and that's going to make a more interesting composition. Normally I would make these still lifes for you in our drawing class, but you're going to need to do those at home now, so that's me coaching you on how to do nice still lives. For me, yeah, I chose a couple things that I know that you're going to have at home, which is hand sanitizer and vegetables, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you need to do. Again, try and find something that's meaningful to you, that would be interesting, but then also isn't too complex. It isn't going to drive you crazy trying to draw it. To start, you're going to start with a 2H pencil, and the reason for that, like I said I was going to tell you, is that we want these proportionate steps, these first several steps in getting proportions correct for your drawing. We want those done with a light pencil because we want to be able to move those lines around until we get the correct proportions, and then we can use the B pencils to make darker lines and finalize the drawing. But with that, when you're going to use that 2H pencil, do not press hard on your paper. Do not incise your paper. If you remember from the drawing materials demo, which I know that you watched, and if you didn't, you need to go back and watch that, I go over the specifics of what these pencils do and why they're what H means, what B means, and why you're not supposed to press hard on H pencils. It's a harder lead, and well, it's not lead, but it's a harder pencil, and you will incise your paper, you will indent it, and you will not be able to lay anything on top of that, and it basically ruins your paper in that area. So we're going to use the 2H pencil, but we're not going to press at all. We're not going to put any pressure on that pencil at all. We're just going to lay it down and move it around. Now, for the purposes of recording, if I were to do that, you couldn't see anything. So I'm going to have to use darker pencils, but again, you're going to be using the 2H pencils at home, and then for the final steps, you're going to pull out the B pencils. Okay? Deal? Shake on it. All right, before we even start, so before step number 1, we're going to look at our still life that we just made, and we're going to determine, is that a horizontal composition or is it a vertical composition? Composition meaning the drawing area that your drawing is going to take up. The thing that you're making that's going to be interesting to look at. Is it horizontal or is it vertical? Now mine is kind of a square, so I could go either way, but I'm going to leave mine vertical for now. But take a look, determine is it horizontal or vertical, change the orientation of your paper if you need to. All right, now our very first step in the citing multiple objects drawing is we're going to cite our access lines. This is the same process that we used in the assignment before, but we're doing multiple objects now. So I'm gonna extend my arm, lock my elbow, I'm holding my citing stick at the very end, I'm squinting one eye, and I'm gonna cite the very largest object first. Now I have my citing stick lined up with the access line of that hand sanitizer, and I am looking at it in relationship to the other objects in my still life. And I'm saying, okay, it's slightly to the right of the rest of my composition. So when I bring it over to my paper, I am going to put it slightly to the right as from the rest of my composition. Okay, keep going. Now I have an onion that kind of, the access line for that slightly dissects into the hand sanitizer access line. So then I bring that over and I keep that in mind when I draw and trace that access line. We're going to do the potato. And when I do that, the front one, I'm thinking about it in relationship again to the other objects and the access lines that I just cited. And it looks like this one's pretty in line with the onion, but I will cite it a couple of times to make sure. Notice how every time I do this, I am not changing the angle of my citing stick. It stays the same, and I'm not unlocking my elbow. The reason why the access line for those potatoes is at an angle like that is, remember, the access line is the line that dissects an object through the core of the center of the form. And for that one, what would most dissect it in the core of the center would be at that kind of an angle. Now I'm going to do this last potato, which relates to that previous one somewhat like that. And I can go around to kind of make sure. Next thing that we'll do, so step number 2, is do a slight gesture of each object. I have 4. We're going to do a slight gesture of each object to kind of fill in the drawing. But again, you're going to do this with a 2H pencil so that you can move your lines around. And before we move on, I want you to see how every access line is here. I have 4 access lines, and that already has a plan. It's already kind of a plan of where each object is going to be. Now, that doesn't mean that this is where each object is going to be. It just means that that's an idea. It might change and move around as I cite and change things. So I'm giving a slight gesture to each object, and that is just to start filling in the page, but I can always move this around and change things. That is just to kind of start filling in the page, breaking up the white of the paper. And as I'm doing these, I'm thinking about each object's relationship to each other, the space between them, and thinking about how I should move things around to compensate for that. Notice how I was using my pencil. I was kind of pretending it was vine a little bit, and I was being very freeform about it with an open arm. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cite the angles and relationship of each object to each other. And so I'm going to start with the top of the lotion. I'm going to work my way down and around. So I just cited that the top of the, not the lotion, but the sanitizer and the side of the potato has a relationship kind of like that. So I went ahead and I just drew that line in there just to remind myself. And now I'm citing these 2 objects in relationship to each other, the potato and the onion, and then on the other side from the onion to the sanitizer, it's kind of like this. So what I just did was I went around all of the exterior points of the objects and cited those angle relationships and brought that over and drew that right in there and traced that angle over. And now what that is called is the envelope. And that is straight lines, tangent lines that go from the exterior points of each object in the composition. Step number 4, I'm going to cite the relative proportions. Remember, that's the second use of citing. I'm going to cite the relative proportions of objects to each other and the heights and the widths of each object. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cite the width and the height of the hand sanitizer compared to itself. So I am holding my citing stick to where the top of the citing stick is one side of the measurement and the tip of my thumb is another. And I'm holding it perfectly horizontally through this part of the hand sanitizer. And then once I have that, now I'm going to flip it vertically, go to the bottom to where my thumb lines up at the bottom of the hand sanitizer, and then go up 1 and 2. So 2.5 is what I measured, but then I also measured that 2 about 2 is also the height of the body of the hand sanitizer, and another half is the nozzle. So if I said this is my width on the drawing when I did my gesture, now I can take that, flip that down, and see how it compares. That's about right. And another half is about the height of the nozzle. So now I know I have about this height and width correct. This is the bottom of the hand sanitizer. I know that that's going to be where it lives. I don't have much else figured out, but I know that's about the size. So if it is, then I can now use this measurement to see how it compares to these things. You also want to use an object that you can see the entirety of it as a good measurement for the rest of the drawing. So I would say this potato in the front here is a good one to use as a measurement for other objects as well. So if I use that, now I'm going to go through the axis line of that potato, and I've taken that measurement and I'm going to bring it somewhere else in the composition and see how it compares. And because I just did this, I'll use that again. So I measured that the width of this potato from here to here was about 3/4 of this from here to here. So let's say it was about right here to the potato. So I'm going to take this. That's pretty on. So now I know that's about that width. Now I'm looking at this, and I'm from my angle, this distance from the potato to the onion is slightly wider. So I'm thinking the onion needs to move over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this measurement that I know is correct, and I'm going to see how it compares to this distance here and see if I need to move the onion over. So I'm going through the potato again and moving it over, and it is a little less than 3/4 from that. So let's say this is that. I would say that this right here was about the distance between the potato and the onion. So then I'll move the siding stick over, and I have that measurement, and this is about where the edge of the onion was. So that means that my gesture has to move over quite a bit. So this is where really the edge of my onion is. So now I know that's where one side is. Now I need to know how the size of it compares to this one. Since I know this is correct, I'll measure this one compared to this one. All that sighting is, especially when sighting multiple objects, you're just interchangeably using all of the uses of sighting. And that's angles and axis lines, relative proportions, and horizontal and vertical points of alignment. And that is your next step, and that is to alternate between the uses of sighting until you get correct proportions. So that's what you're going to watch me do, but there is no possible way that you're going to be able to mimic the exact same steps that I'm doing in my drawing with your drawing, because it's going to be different objects, and objects are going to relate to each other differently. But that's why you need to know those 3 uses of sighting very well and be able to alternate between them for your own purposes. So if you're sitting at home and you're like, oh, she's doing that, but I can't do that, well, don't stress out. You just need to know those uses and be able to alternate between them on your own. So again, that's angles and axis lines, that's relative proportions, and that's horizontal and vertical points of alignment. We went over those pretty in depth in the first demo as well. So if you need a refresher, don't feel bad about going back and watching it. But to walk you through how I'm doing this drawing, my next step is I need to get the proportions of this onion correct before I can move on here. So let's see how it compares to that potato, because again, this is an object that I can see the entirety of it. So I'm going to, and it's a smaller object than this one, so this is what I'm going to use to measure the rest of these objects from. So, and that is 1 to almost the outside of the center, and it's a little less than 1.5. So again, relative proportions is where I make a measurement in space and I mimic it on my drawing, because this is a blown up version of that. So I'm going to recreate what I just did. I said this was a little less than 1.5 of this. So I have 1 here, bring it over, 1, and then a little less than a half would be right in here. So my onion had to move a little bit, and I'm going to regesture that in its correct spot. And I will erase my previous gesture because those lines before are going to confuse me if I keep them there. So that is my onion moved over, and that looks about correct. The other thing I did measure was that the middle of the onion was just inside of this width here, so it would have been right about in here is where that middle like little root system comes out. Now I need to measure this one. I've got the proportions generally correct here. I also need to cite the height here to make sure. And so I also need this size as well. So I've got to finalize these two here. Going again, every time that I've measured this potato, I've gone through this axis line right here from here. So I'm going to do that again. And I flipped it flipped it 90 degrees to see how it compared to its length. And what I measured was the height of it was about this much of its length. So I brought my citing stick over, recreated that measurement, and now I'm bringing it over like this and saying, okay, this is about that length or that height of this potato. So what I might do is erase a little bit of what's going on out here because it might just confuse me keeping all that out there. Okay, so here is where this potato is living, and I haven't really nailed it down yet, but I do know its height and its width. Now I gotta finalize this one. All right, one more time. These two lengths are about the same, so I'll recreate that. And it's about right here. Boom, boom. Now what is its height here comparatively? And it's a little less than its length, but how does it compare to this one? It's a little bit more. So I'm recreating this measurement here, saying, okay, this is about where it would be for this one. And it's a little less than its length for this. So it's somewhere in here is the height of this potato. Okay, now what I'll do, I have general proportions of each thing. Now I'm going to do straight line construction around each object to start to find the contours of each object. So watch me as I cite angles and I bring them to the paper and recreate this on a two-dimensional surface. I'm also alternating between all of the different uses of citing. Again, remember, angles and axis lines, relative proportion, and horizontal and vertical points of alignment. Right now I'm kind of alternating between angles and axis lines and horizontal and vertical points of alignment. I just did a ton of relative proportions here. That's how I did all of these. When I did these measurements and I moved them around, that's relative proportions. I did a ton of that. So now I'm kind of using uses 1 and 3 right now, angles and axis lines and horizontal and vertical points of alignment. So that's what I'm doing as you see me kind of going back and forth like this. That's what I'm doing. Angles and axis lines and seeing how things are lining up vertically and horizontally. Anytime you have a symmetrical object, you need to use that axis line to help mimic each side to the other. So I have a symmetrical object here with the sanitizer because it's in a bottle that's exactly the same on either side. So that access line helps me to mimic each side to each other. The last thing I'm going to measure is the top of this sanitizer bottle, because it's the one thing that's still just kind of a gesture. So I need to measure the width of it compared to the height to see, and I know the height. So it's a little over half of its own height. So I take this over, and a little over half of that would be right about here. So then I take that and divide that around that access line, and that's about where the width of my cap is. I could also sight an angle from here to see, and I will do that real quick just to see. And yeah, that is about where that would lie. If your objects happen to have shadows, it might be a good idea to kind of outline those shadows. Not a ton of information. We're not going to add value to these drawings, but that does add to the composition to just give an outline to those shadows. So mine happens to have shadows, so I will give a slight outline to those. All right, so I have a general straight line construction and a general idea of the composition. So now I'm going to start adding more detail, citing and adding interior information, and again, using my citing stick to see where things plan out. But again, still just using the 2H pencil, planning it out, and then once I really know I have everything, then I'm going to start using that darker line. If you have objects with a lot of reflections, this would be a good time to start outlining those reflections, and that helps to add texture to the object. So once we kind of move past general proportions, we're looking at interior information to help clue the viewer on what that is that they're looking at. So if it's a reflective object, it's going to have a lot of highlights in it, really sharp lined highlights. But if it is a kind of like these vegetables, like a more of an opaque object that has a matted texture, it's going to have a different kind of shapes on it indicating the texture of that thing. So for the potatoes, I have some like knotted parts in here. I'm not going to do every little divot in there, but I will try and get this end of the onion, not every little strand, but maybe out from the onion I'll have some markers indicating the striations of the outside of the onion. And then for the Germex, I'll just give a little outline of the label. I'm not going to go through and write all the letters. We're not going to do that. We're not going to try and write text on the object in case your objects have text. You're just looking at generalized information on that object, but indicators of texture are really good. So for this, it has really sharp highlights on here that I'm going to give an outline to, but again, no value. We're just outlining it, that shape, because the purpose of this beginning drawing process, the beginning of drawing 1, is to teach you how to draw proportions and looking at different shapes and interpreting those shapes onto a two-dimensional surface. And then later we'll worry about value, but right now we're not focusing on value. So again, thinking about texture and thinking about interior contours, that is interior information that you can give your objects to clue the viewer in and what those objects are. So what I just did was I went around vertically and horizontally through my composition to see, and through the still life to see if things lined up correctly in my drawing. And for the yes, they do. So if anything needed to move, I would have spent some time to move it. Now take as much time as you need on this assignment. Again, for last assignment and this one, we're slowing way down and trying to see how closely can we get proportions correct to real life. So what I've been doing for the last little bit is planning out my drawing so that I'm confident enough to go in with a darker pencil and know where I'm going to put that darker pencil. So that whole process was really just planning out for finishing the drawing. And I'd like to do some more planning out, and then I will go in with the darker pencils to finish out the drawing, and I'll show you how I go about doing that. Okay, so I've planned out quite a bit of this drawing, and I feel confident enough to move to my B pencils, or as confident as I'm going to be. So I've grabbed a 2B, and I might grab a 4B, and I will start to add some detail here, and you can kind of watch me as I start to outline the exterior and interior contours. Remember, that is exterior lines as well as interior lines on the object. So that's the outside of the object and the inside of the object that will help indicate what those objects are and give the viewer an indication of texture to hopefully clue them in on what they are, so that you can look at it and say, that's that thing. That's all in texture. So watch me as I start to outline these things. Okay, so that is about as far as I'm going to take this drawing. Again, your steps were to, 1, set your axis lines to start planning out the composition. And when you're citing those axis lines, you're citing them compared to each other, each object compared to each other. Go to the beginning of the video if you need a reminder on that. Second thing you're going to do is do general gesture of each object to start to fill in and break up the weight of the paper. Then you're going to cite relative proportions of each object's height and width. Again, go to that part of the video if you need a reminder on that. And then what I started to do was cite the envelope, so citing angles of objects related to each other. That was citing angles between exterior points of each object to make sure that things were placed about where they go. Again, still all in the planning stages of the composition, and still using that light H pencil and not putting any pressure on it so that you can erase and move things around as you need. And then we're alternating between all 3 uses of citing until we get the correct proportions of all of the objects in the composition. Remember, those 3 uses of citing are angles and axis lines, relative proportions, and horizontal and vertical points of alignment. So remember, I was alternating between all 3 of those until I got about what I knew to be relative proportions. So you're not just measuring objects in relationship to each other, so their height and their width compared to each other. Again, that's a relative proportion that's in the air, and then you're mimicking that on the paper and enlarging it. But you're also measuring objects in the compared to the space between the objects. So you're measuring both positive and negative space. So I know that's a lot of terms, but slow down, go back and watch the video and make sure you understand it as you're moving forward. And then I spent some time to plan out the composition with lighter pencils to prepare myself for the darker pencils. So I was just planning out and giving myself enough detail so that I could know where I'm going to use those darker pencils at. And this is not at all a high level of detail. It's a very low level of detail. I could have spent several more hours on that before moving on. And then that last and final step is pulling out those B pencils, the darker pencils, and start to lay out darker line to really make the drawing pop. And yeah, just start having those objects come off the page. And again, I could have spent a lot more time on that and finished that off. But I believe I've given you enough information, enough in this demo for you to move forward. So, all right, that is citing multiple objects. It is a hefty one, so don't think that you can just zoom through this. It's definitely something you need to slow down, take your time, and don't get frustrated. If you find yourself getting frustrated, just maybe take a break and come back. But watch this video as many times as you need to really get and understand the process of citing. I might have gone through things kind of fast in this video, but this is a video, so you can stop it, go back, and rewatch things. So I have full confidence in you that you can do this, and yeah, I'm excited to see the drawings that you make. All right, good luck, guys.